everyone for joining. I guess we can get started. Welcome, good evening. I'm Cole Harrison, Executive Director of Mass Peace Action. And I want to welcome you to our, I think it's the sixth presentation in our Anti-Racism and Peace series. Tonight we're going to talk with Stuart Schrader, a scholar at Johns Hopkins who locates the roots of America's militarized police practices in our half-century of counterinsurgency and empire, as the US sought to control dozens of countries across the world through a combination of policing, irregular armed groups, and military force. Stuart is a lecturer and assistant research scientist in sociology at Johns Hopkins, teaches courses in Africana studies, international studies, political science, and sociology. He's also the associate director of the program in racism, immigration, and citizenship. And his PhD is in American Studies from NYU in 2015. He's also taught at Harvard and at NYU. And his 2019 book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Insurgency Transformed American Policing, I'm gonna hold it up. This way, addresses security, policing, and counterinsurgency in the 1960s and 70s. And okay, so we're going to do our conversation tonight in a little bit different format than we have done in the past. It's going to be a conversation between Stuart and me rather than him giving a formal talk. So this is a little bit of an experiment to see if it turns out more interactive or innovative that way. Participants, please put your questions in the chat as we go along. I'll ask several questions and Stuart and I will go back and forth. And as the critical mass of questions from participants starts to accumulate, at some point we'll switch over and start taking questions from you. Let's put Stuart's face up instead of mine. And my first question is for Stuart is, how was police assistance involved in the US counterinsurgency wars of the 60s and 70s and 80s? And how did it come to influence US domestic policing practices? Welcome, Stuart.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here with all of you tonight, and thank you for attending. So my book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, is about two processes. The first is the US provision of police assistance to countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa during the Cold War, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then second, how that police assistance program overseas influenced and affected policing within the United States subsequently. In the 1960s, as many of you will know, Lyndon Johnson declared a war on crime in 1965, which really got going in 1968 with the creation of a body called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. And this new investment in crime control, policing, and other forms of social control took influence from the overseas program, drew new technologies from it, and also drew on the personnel in that program. The police assistance program really got its initial start at the end of World War II, during the occupations of Japan and Germany, when the United States sent some of its most prominent police leaders to those countries with the idea of, basically rebuilding from the ground up the police forces of these, defeated authoritarian regimes. The idea was that in order to prevent the rise of a new authoritarian power, a kind of American-style police system had to be instituted. Of course, police in the United States are organized in a relatively disconnected fashion. There is not just one police force operated, from the top echelons of Washington. In fact, there are, many, many thousands of police forces around the country, municipal, state, and other. So the idea was to try to replicate this very decentralized form in the defeated powers. And the idea was to use, American know-how, American techniques of policing, draw on American technologies, some of the most basic ones. Japan's police uniform that would be replaced the replacement would come from the Kansas City police uniform. And I mentioned Kansas City because one of the key leaders of the program to rebuild the Japanese police force had been a police officer in Kansas City, and his name was Byron Engel. And he basically was a kind of whiz kid of policing in Kansas City, and after the war went to Japan and really never looked back, and spent the next few decades of his life becoming one of the most widely traveled people in the US Foreign Service. He eventually joined up with the CIA, and throughout the 50s, worked under various auspices, undercover, but he was a CIA officer, and he worked traveling around the globe, helping police forces. Now, of course, in addition to the idea of preventing the rise of a new, Japanese imperial force like had preceded the war, there was another, perhaps more important goal of this.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
You didn't bring a bag, did you?
Oh, no. Are you out of bag?
That was to prevent the rise of a communist force in Japan and even more broadly on the Pacific Rim. Now, of course, the United States was not successful in that prevention effort, of course, with the Chinese Revolution, ultimately, of course, with the war in Korea and so on. But nevertheless, the idea of using police to prevent the rise of a communist government, stuck. And the CIA ultimately tried to do that in a number of countries. And Byron Engel, that guy who went from Kansas City to Japan, he became the leader of a program called the Office of Public Safety, which was created in the beginning of the 1960s under the Kennedy administration. And the Office of Public Safety formalized the police assistance program, ultimately offering police assistance to 52 countries in so-called third world countries around the globe, and training police officers, mostly high-ranking police officers from 77 countries around the globe in a training academy that was built in Washington, D.C. called the International Police Academy. So Byron Engel led this operation, which hired several hundred of the most prominent and technically proficient police from around the country. These were the guys who wrote policing textbooks. They devised new investigative technologies, new telecommunications technologies, and so forth. They were the ones who wrote the handbooks on riot control. So they were the leaders of policing within the United States. They traveled around the globe. Many of them spent, more than a decade going, hopscotching from one country to another. And in every country they went to, they would, introduce new technical implements that police needed, ranging from fingerprint laboratories to surveillance technologies to radio telecommunications, to new motorcycle and vehicle patrols. And they would also, of course, instill as best they could an ideology of anti-communism. And they would introduce new armaments, firearms, tear gas. I spend a whole chapter in the book talking about tear gas. And in many of these countries, the police forces that ultimately resulted from this assistance that the United States provided, of course, became highly repressive They cracked down on student movements, they cracked down on labor movements, workers' organizations, all in the goal of, preventing influence from, Moscow or Beijing from grabbing hold. But in the process, they oftentimes, saw phantoms and repressed regular people who had very little to do with any kind of organized connection to the Soviet Union or other countries. These figures, these police advisors, public safety advisors, they were called, many of them returned back home to the United States to, as I mentioned, work for agencies like the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. Some of them went on to other federal law enforcement careers. Some of them returned home and became police chiefs in various cities and towns across the country. Some of them became prison wardens. And a number of them, as I'd be happy to talk about, went into the private security domain after the 1970s. So that's kind of the big picture of what I talk about in the book. I trace the operations of the Office of Public Safety in a number of countries, in South Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and a few others. And then I trace the careers of a number of the officials as they influence policing back in the United States.
Okay. So could you elaborate more on the impact of how these policing practices came back to the United States? What difference did it make to American policing when these police leaders came back after being overseas?
I didn't quite catch all of that, but I think you were asking about what happened. What were the effects after they came back in the United States?
Yeah, what impact did they have on policing practices inside the United States, and how did that work?
Yeah. Okay. So there are a number of things that we can point to. So the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration was ultimately responsible for delivering a whole lot of money to law enforcement agencies across the United States. Basically took money from Washington and put it in the hands of the states. And the idea was that it should be used for innovative programs that would increase the effectiveness of law enforcement. Now, whether it increased the effectiveness of law enforcement is something that I think many people would debate, but I think it's absolutely true that it increased the capacities of law enforcement. And many scholars who I am in dialogue with have pointed to the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration as kind of a crucial step toward the development of mass incarceration, because it so increased police capabilities, police strength, and power. The blueprints for designing the Law Enforcement Administration as this agency that would take resources, know-how, expertise from Washington and distribute them around the country, the blueprints drew explicitly on the Office of Public Safety. The idea was, in the 1960s, in fact, as early as the fall of 1964, which was after the first round of urban unrest in cities like Harlem, Rochester, and a number of other places, some officials got in touch with Lyndon Johnson's aides on questions of crime and said, hey, look, this unrest that has happened in 1964, in the summer of 1964, has proven that police in the United States are not up to the task of keeping a lid on civil unrest. They need expertise, they need new equipment, they need better training, they need more money. And in fact, the United States already knows how to do this because it's doing it overseas with the Office of Public Safety. So that set into motion the creation of the blueprints for the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. And it was in fact true that in 1968, when it came online, its initial outlay of funding, a lot of it went to riot control, so-called riot control, training and equipment. Including, of course, shields, gas masks, helmets, tear gas itself, and then a new training program that was designed to be available to police, National Guard, Army soldiers, and so forth. This training program, it was actually operated by the Army. It was called the Senior Officers Civil Disturbance Operations Course, if I remember correctly, or CDOC. And CDOC was modeled in many ways on the International Police Academy that the Office of Public Safety operated. In addition to delivering tear gas to many police agencies, more mundane types of advances for police started to become available once the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration was offering money to, in many cases, cash-strapped police forces in, you name it, all over the country. So new radio walkie-talkies started to become available, and the money for the purchase of them became available from Washington. The cheap and durable types of walkie-talkies that many police forces wanted to adopt, they were designed by technicians who worked for the Office of Public Safety. And so I go through in the book, a number of examples along these lines. I think that the tear gas example is kind of the most prominent, and it's of course been on a lot of people's minds over the past few months because police in the United States have been using tear gas to such a great degree. In fact, the Kerner Commission, which investigated the causes of the urban unrest of 1967, predominantly in Newark and Detroit, the Kerner Commission, its chief investigator who worked on law enforcement issues. Of course, they investigated issues of poverty and racism and so forth, but they also investigated law enforcement. The chief investigator was a guy whose name was Arnold Saglin. He was buddies with Byron Engel. He was the one who offered the idea of the Office of Public Safety as the blueprint for the LEAA. He also invited Engel to testify before the Kerner Commission. And Engel told the Kerner Commission that police in the United States should start using tear gas to a much greater degree than they had previously. And they should use, in fact, the form of tear gas called CS, which was very popularly used by the US military in Vietnam. So Saglin was responsible for getting those recommendations into the Kerner Commission report, again, drawing on the experience of the Office of Public Safety. So those are just some of the ways that ultimately the Office of Public Safety influenced law enforcement after 1968. And the one thing that I would just add to end this point is to say, in every country that the Office of Public Safety operated, all 52 of them, the police forces that came out on the other side after the United States provided assistance were larger, were better equipped, and were, in many cases, more, they developed new divisions and new types of police, right? If there weren't really secret police beforehand, you can bet that there were secret police afterwards. But if there weren't traffic police beforehand, you can bet there were traffic police afterwards. So they ranged the gamut from really mundane forms of policing to very specialized and secretive forms of policing. I think that the same is basically true in the United States, that although police forces have not necessarily increased in size, a colleague of mine who works on Chicago told me that the Chicago Police Department is basically the same size as it was in the 1960s. But in many jurisdictions, there are new types of police and new bodies authorized with law enforcement capabilities. So in Baltimore, for example, where I am right now, there's of course the BPD, but there is also the water department has its police department, the train authority, transportation authority has its own police department, the courts have their own police department, and on and on and on. You can go down the list. Many of these new police forces across the country started to come online in the aftermath of the 1960s, and of course, furthermore in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001. So I think we can draw a really direct link from the US operations overseas against so-called, enemies, national security threats via policing, and the expansion of police power, the scope of policing, the creation of new agencies within the United States.
Right. So in this Cold War era, the US was, as you said, trying to avoid communist revolutions, as it saw in many third world countries. In fact, I'll just recount that in 1970, I was a 17-year-old student in Tokyo, Japan, and I was at an anti-war protest, and I was tear gassed. So it was an enormous deployment of tear gas in downtown Tokyo. But anyway, I don't know if that had anything to do with the
You can blame
programs you're
Byron Engel for
describing.
that.
Yeah. But anyway, it had an explicitly political purpose, right? That they were trying to stabilize these regimes and fight off the prospect of left-wing insurgency. So how does that map? How did they understand the way that mapped to the mission of police in the United States? Did they see a communist under every corner, or did they see that this was sort of a value neutral policing that would just be part of good government and wasn't directly addressed at a leftist threat?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I think that actually I would say both are true. On the one hand, there was a strong belief that the police could be value neutral and apolitical. And this was what the United States tried to instill around the globe. On the other hand, that neutrality did not extend to neutrality when it came to left-wing political goals. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there, which if you were to ask any of the people that I wrote about, I don't think they would really see it as a contradiction, because they believed ultimately that communism or left-wing radicalism and subversion was such a threat to social order that to oppose it was simply to uphold a modern, liberal, rational, capitalist society. Many of the people who worked for the Office of Public Safety had experienced training with the FBI. Many of them were acolytes of J. Edgar Hoover. And J. Edgar Hoover, of course, was a virulent anti-communist, as were many other prominent police leaders of this period after World War II. It was interestingly, both anti-communism was instilled, taught, cultivated, but it was also kind of just the air that they breathed, the water they swam in. It was kind of unquestioned. So bringing police to the United States to be trained, entailed a bit of ideological indoctrination, a set of loyalty tests. It wasn't always guaranteed that it would work, but of course, police in many of these countries were already predisposed to anti-communism, so it wasn't necessarily a great struggle for the United States to convince them of the necessity of anti-communism. There was, however, a crucial point, and this kind of feeds into the discussion that I have in the book of this idea of counterinsurgency, which was a word that was really adopted by the Kennedy administration. The idea was that insurgency would be the result of external subversive forces destabilizing a country. And what made a country susceptible to this sort of destabilization was, on the one hand, economic and social dislocation that actually went along with economic development. There was no question that urbanization, industrialization, the introduction of new forms of telecommunications, TV, radio, and so forth, the creation of new forms of education and literacy, all of this would disrupt society. There was no question. Then the United States wanted that type of disruption because the idea was that it would lead to more intensive use of capitalist economic forms. But at the same time, this disruption would make people susceptible to appeals from widely subversive operators who would make a claim that if there was instability, well, our political program will provide you with stability. And that's what the United States was afraid of. So they were afraid of people coming from outside and influencing the political situation. They were afraid that people would be susceptible because of economic instability and social instability. And they would, of course, worry that there were actively hostile elements operating within the country. So the police, the reason to focus on police in this program of preventing insurgency, counterinsurgency really means preventing it from breaking out in the first place. On the one hand, it means arresting those, active subversives that they can find. It means keeping them from crossing over the border and bringing contraband. And some of the contraband may be, leaflets or pamphlets with subversive ideas written in them. And it also means providing economic development assistance to populations that are experiencing some instability and wondering whether they're gonna, slide backwards and experience greater poverty. So they need to be afforded various forms of economic development assistance. And the Office of Public Safety, as the police assistance program, was lodged in the Agency for International Development. It was basically a development agency. So all of that went together to provide, what they called internal security.
So to drive that economic development model, they had to have a social control and security apparatus as part of it, I see. Well, I wanted to ask about the evolution of militarized policing in the United States, especially in some of these recent protests this year and other times. We've really been struck by the military gear used by police. As you mentioned, the shields and masks and the MRAPs, and it's been deployed in city after city across the United States. And we actually had a discussion a few weeks ago about the 1033 program, in which the DoD currently gives military supposedly surplus equipment, as I understand it, to police forces to further them. But what's the root of this turn towards a more militarized police force in the United States, and what role do you see that playing?
Well, I look at this in my book in a historical context, and I would basically say, even, of course, my book begins at the end of World War II, and I think you could go back to the early part of the 20th century, and you would find that the police experts who are at the kind of forefront in the profession within the United States, they really think of militarization as a good thing. They don't necessarily think of it in the sense we think of it today. They think of militarization as rigorous training, a lot of skill at things like marksmanship, a rank hierarchy, and a set of kind of programs to instill, discipline. So the figures who go overseas at the end of World War II, including Byron Engel, they would absolutely say, we should militarize police in order to, in that sense, make them more reliable, more effective, well-disciplined, impervious to corruption, and so forth. When we say militarization today, as you mentioned, Cole, we're talking about the 1033 program, the implementation of, or the adoption of these types of weapons. But it actually turns out that there's a connection between these two things. This idea of creating a disciplined, well-trained officer and the adoption of military weapons. Because over and over and over again, at the end of every war, you have, on the one hand, veterans going into the military, veterans from the military going into the police. And on the other hand, you have surplus military gear being provided to the police. After World War II, the FBI tells police around the country how they can get surplus military gear, including heavy armaments. In the even during the war in Vietnam, there is surplus military gear being delivered to police, and in many cases, police themselves are asking for it. They're saying, look, we don't have enough money to buy this stuff ourselves, and we also are facing, incalculable threats to our own safety, so we need this kind of military gear. So this just keeps happening. When you get to the 1990s, when it's really expanded and formalized under Clinton, and this is in part because the military starts taking on a drug enforcement role. So you have, on the one hand, the military taking on kind of police, policification or politicization, however you would call it, at the same time as you have the police undergoing militarization, right? So after the 1990s, and certainly after September 11th, the police start to adopt even more military gear. But it's from a baseline that I would say is already somewhat militarized. The police are already understanding themselves in kind of military terms. They're defining their mission in terms of enemies, and they already have access to a lot of really heavy weaponry. Even before 1033, and then it only intensifies when 1033 comes into place, and certainly is expanded after September 11th, when, of course, the Department of Homeland Security starts giving resources to police. The DOJ expands how much money it's giving to police. So now police can get military gear from the Pentagon, they can get it from the DOJ or DHS, they can buy it themselves if they have money in their budgets, and they can oftentimes also get it from foundation donations. So there's lots and lots of routes for the police to get this military gear. So although I think that the 1033 program should be ended, I think it would be very easy for much of the surplus material that the Pentagon has given to police forces for the Pentagon to take it back. It actually remains the property, a lot of it, of the Pentagon. Even if that happens, there are still these other routes that I think we need to be aware of.
I was thinking about the Breonna Taylor case, where you have this SWAT team attacking an apartment, and trigger happy and firing without knowing who they're firing at. And then the use of police on the protests that we've seen in cities across the country, with helicopters and everything. And it just seems like this militarization has become a standard feature. How long has this been going on? And I guess what I really want to know is how the proponents of this style of policing understand what they're doing. And the repressive policing clearly produces a response, and so it escalates the situation. How do they see this?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a couple of things to say about this. On the one hand, the use of a SWAT team to do something like serve a warrant, which is the predominant way that SWAT teams are being used, is clearly unnecessary and clearly leads to the types of wanton violence like what killed Breonna Taylor.
Clearly, but
in essence,
but not to them. I mean, they don't seem to be clear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what the evidence suggests is that once these specialized units are created, they are unlikely to only be used in specialized settings. They get used in everyday types of policing. I think there are some people who were involved in the kind of creation and dissemination of the SWAT idea who believed that it should really be only used in specialized situations. It should be, a marker of really deep training and deep discipline. That's clearly just not been the case. When we talk about protests, exactly as you said, it's clear that the use of intimidating, body armor, military-style trucks, military-style weaponry, and of course, there's a lot of weaponry and technologies that we may not even really know are being used in terms of surveillance and so forth. All of that, I think you're absolutely right, escalates the situation rather than de-escalates it. It makes it worse. I think before this summer, I would have thought that in some cases the police, are interested in de-escalation. I think that after the summer, I would say that I was wrong. It's quite clear that the use of these types of gear, uniforms, and weaponry and so forth is for political purposes. And the tactics are political. Police have been trained to respond to the form of protest. If protesters are blocking traffic, then they should be pushed to the sidewalk. If protesters are massing in such a way that they are potentially trapping police, they should be dispersed, right? The form of the protest should dictate how the protest control, crowd control methods are deployed. That is absolutely not what has been happening over the summer. The police are responding to the content rather than the form of the protest. Police are responding to arguments about defunding the police. They're responding to criticisms in Portland of Trump. And they're therefore responding in what can only be called a political fashion. And they're using their gear and their weaponry and so forth purely for political purposes, and they are ultimately escalating these situations rather than de-escalating. They're intensifying the scope, scale, and extent of the unrest and protest. They're making it violent. They are also pushing protesters to engage in new types of protest tactics, some of which are really creative and impressive. They aren't necessarily violent. But of course, police are always afraid of new and unexpected protest tactics. So they oftentimes overcorrect when there are new protest tactics and treat them as if they're violent.
Okay. So in terms of the present movement, what kinds of reforms to policing will make a difference, and what types of reforms will not make any difference to the outcomes? If we're concerned about 1,000 people being killed a year by police, if we're concerned about police maintaining an unjust social order and repressing protests to it. What should we be asking for?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is the key question, right? And of course, as you mentioned, if the social order is unjust and police are upholding it, it raises a really challenging paradox. Because I would say that we have to change the unjust social order to change the policing, but police seem to be the barrier to that. So that is kind of the fundamental question of that has been raised by the past few months of protest. I do think that there are both kind of national level and local level changes that can be made. At the national level, as I mentioned, the 1033 program can be canceled. The Pentagon could take back surplus material that it still is under its control. And the Pentagon should do that, and then it should destroy it and make it so that nobody can use it. Congress could make that issue that in legislation tomorrow. It's a political question, not a logistical question. I think that the local transformation is perhaps a lower bar in some places. Of course, it's a higher bar in some places. But certainly after the past few months of protests, in many municipalities, city councils, mayors and other officials have said, okay, we're going to make a change to what police can do. We're going to say police can't use certain chemical agents. Police can't use, certain weaponry. Whether these changes will stick, I think, is a really, difficult question. It already seems like many of the pledges to defund the police that elected officials made over the summer at the kind of height of protests are kind of crashing on the shoals of political reality, or what at least elected officials want to claim as political reality. So it's unclear how this will all unfold, but absolutely at the local level, it is 100% possible to ban tear gas, ban sound cannons, ban SWAT teams, and so on and so on and so on. With the defunding police question, in Baltimore, for example, of course, the city council budget meeting about where they discussed defunding the police, it was relatively early on in the protest. It was at the end of June, but some city council members said, yeah, we want to defund the police. We want to cut some aspects of the police budget, and asked the chief, okay, what can be cut? And the chief came back and said, all right, you can cut the equestrian unit and you can cut the boat unit, the harbor unit. It's quite clear that the equestrian unit and the harbor unit are probably the units least likely to engage in civil rights violations. They're not likely to stop and frisk anybody. So from my perspective, these are the units that are in least need of being cut, even though they seem like the kind of low-hanging fruit. So this is a real problem that I think will continue to vex policymakers, elected officials, which is that they will go to the police, say, all right, we want to defund something, and the police will come back and say, yeah, you can defund the least important part of the police department. So I think it just requires some savvy on the part of policymakers and elected officials to plan for some of this. But ultimately, the big question, what will be a reform that will change the situation? Any reform that reduces the scope and scale of policing, reduces police power, is the type of reform that I think is necessary. What that looks like in practice, of course, the devil is in the details. Most of the reforms that have been proposed, like body cameras, bias training, and so forth, do not reduce the scope and scale and power of police. If anything, they extend it and increase it. And that's why those reforms, I think, should be ultimately thrown out the window.
And as to the politics of the reform process or the reform struggle, actually, we were talking before the attendees joined that you're starting to do some work on the politics of the police themselves. And could you talk about a little bit about that, and also about what kind of coalition has the political potential to actually make some changes?
I couldn't really understand that question. I'm sorry.
I want you to talk about the politics of the
your
reform
voice is
struggle.
coming through clearly for me.
Oh, I see. Brian, am I clear to you?
Yes,
My
I
voice?
can hear you just fine, Cole. Can you hear me, Stuart?
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you a little better, Brian.
I think what Cole is trying to ask is about your new project, about the politics of the police themselves. Do I have that right, Cole?
Yes, but also on the progressive side, what kind of coalition can we put into place that would actually have the political power to make changes?
Okay, yeah.
To both sides of the reform struggle.
Right, okay. So can you hear me okay? It's just that I can't hear you okay.
Yeah, hear you just fine.
Yeah, okay. All right, so sorry about that. So the question is about the politics of police and what kind of coalitions can we create to work against the power of police. Yeah. Yes. So on the one hand, I think what a lot of people have obviously become aware of over recent years, perhaps with the rise of Trump, but also certainly in the past few months, is how politically engaged and active police are. Police are endorsing candidates for election. The national FOP endorsed Trump, again, endorsed Trump in 2016. But also, the head of the New York City PBA, Patrick Lynch, he spoke at the GOP's political convention. So these types of political activities by police, I mean, in some sense, these are kind of the most superficial versions. They get a lot of attention, but really the kind of political activities that are going on through lobbying, backdoor or backroom dealing are the ones that we really need to be the most concerned about. And of course, those are the ones that we kind of know the least about at the same time. So I think that what is necessary is for people to work, again, at a local scale, local or state scale, work with friendly elected officials to find out what type of lobbying police are doing in their areas, so that they can target it more closely. I mean, I do think that the police police unions in New York City, taking their fight to Twitter, taking their fight to the RNC, I think that this actually suggests that they're not as powerful in the kind of smoke-filled back rooms as they used to be. They're now using different modes of trying to get their way. But their power is still significant. I think absolutely coalitions are essential, given this group, given what all of you are interested in. I think there's no question that the peace movement, the anti-war movement, the movement to constrain the power of the Department of Defense, as well as intelligence agencies and so forth, I think it has to be really deeply aligned with and in coalition with movements that are working against police power on the ground. I can't tell you how to do that in your town, because I think in every town it's going to look a little different, but it's absolutely crucial, because ultimately, the main thrust of my research, the main thrust of the political work that I care about and that I'm engaged in, is to say that we really can't draw a bright line between the problems of US foreign policy and war overseas and the problems of domestic policy and policing and incarceration at home. They're deeply intertwined. My research shows historically how they have been intertwined for a very long time. And it therefore requires that we, in our movements, we press on both sides of this issue simultaneously, because as we can see, there's no way to understand what police have been doing over the past few months without thinking about the influence of the military, the massive amounts of technologies that are available to them. And when we find out about all of the surveillance and communications technologies that police have been using over the past few months, especially federal law enforcement, what we will learn, we don't know all the details, but what we will learn is that all of these technologies were technologies that have been tested in places like Iraq or Syria. It's guaranteed.
Right, thank you. And could you talk about the current presidential campaign, the rhetoric that Trump has been using, the rhetoric that Biden has been using? So how are these issues playing out in the context of the current political season?
Well, I have to say that in May and June, I guess, the murder of George Floyd happened at the very end of May. June was when the protests really started ramping up. July was when they kind of changed their character, and protests in Portland really started occupying a lot of people's attention. Although protests continued in many, many places, even though all eyes were on Portland. Protests probably in many places where y'all are living were continuing. Democrats in Congress put forth a bill that was pretty good, was not great, and then some more progressive members of Congress, including Anna Presley and some others, put forth a somewhat better bill called the BREATHE Act. So the BREATHE Act is out there. I think it's a pretty good piece of legislation as far as Congress goes. The initial bill, however, that the Democrats put forth did something interesting, which was that it said that there would be new mechanisms of kind of accountability and oversight for police that would be issued at the federal level. This is new. I mean, ultimately the bill didn't go anywhere, but this is new. In the 1994 crime bill, which of course is attached to Joe Biden's, legacy in the Senate, it provided a ton of money, as Joe Biden said, to hire 100,000 new cops, as Bill Clinton said, to hire 100,000 new cops. That money came basically with no strings attached. There were no mechanisms for accountability or oversight, no conditions attached to it. So the fact that the Democrats in Congress put forth a bill that had some, conditions, some mechanisms for accountability, I think, is notable. Ultimately, the bill didn't go anywhere, but also at the very same moment that bill was offered up, Biden wrote an op-ed, I think in USA Today or somewhere, where he said he wanted to give more money to police. So I think that this is a fight that's happening within the Democratic Party. If anything, Biden represents the more conservative edge of the Democratic Party on these issues. Figures like AOC, Presley, and others represent obviously the more progressive side. So this is a fight that's going to, if Biden wins, play out in the Democratic Party. And then of course, on the other hand, the Republicans in Congress are quite, retrograde on these issues. So ultimately, I think that the kind of law and order question is a big question in the election. Whether Trump and Biden actually differ all that greatly on questions of law and order, I think could be debated. I mean, I think there are differences that are worth pointing to, but even still, I think that Biden, represents kind of the conservative side of the Democratic Party on this. Trump is so far to the right that it creates a lot of room for conservative Democrats.
Right. Well, we should probably bring some attendee questions in. There's quite a lot of good ones that have been
Sure.
asked, and I barely had a chance to go through them, to be honest. Have you had a chance to look these over at all, Brian?
Yes, I
Let's-
have, and I have a list going.
Oh, good for you. Why don't you ask a question?
Sure.
Or
Well,
call on someone to ask it if you think that would work.
I'll ask. I want to ask one myself, actually. So I'll be selfish. What do you make of Stuart? What do you make of the many thin blue line flags that we're seeing all over the country? I think this speaks to the political side of it as well. But I've heard many people say that this is a fascist emblem, masquerading as support for the police, and I'd like to get your opinion on that.
Sure. Yeah, I have a relative in Massachusetts actually who got into a bit of a political struggle with some people in his town about whether these types of symbols could be displayed on town property or not. Ultimately, he convinced the town not to display these symbols on town property, but then neighbors just put more of them on their own private property. So anyway, yeah, I mean, the concept of the thin blue line goes back decades and decades. Many people will point to William H. Parker, the chief of the LAPD in the 50s and into the 60s, as the kind of author of this idea, or if not author, at least the person who disseminated it most widely. Incidentally, William Parker was part of the U.S. occupation of Germany and the reform of police there. So, in some sense, all of these figures, all roads lead back to U.S. foreign policy and anti-communism. So the thin blue line goes from being this kind of organizing principle or ideology for police, and of course the idea is that police are the kind of bearers of safety and security. And on the other side of them is anarchy, chaos, danger, and so forth. It's questionable whether people who are using the term in that way nowadays mean it in the same sense. When it's used in a flag, when it's kind of like embedded in a Punisher skull, I think you're quite right, Brian, that it has these fascist tones to it. Now, we could argue about whether it always had this kind of fascist implication. Was William H. Parker himself a fascist? I mean, so we could have a debate about that. But I think it is quite clear that now it has taken on this symbolism that people can identify with, even if they're not police. And that, to me, is what has become creepy and potentially dangerous about it. That it is becoming this kind of device under which people signal their political affiliation. And it's lucrative for the people who make the T-shirts and the stickers. And who knows what they're doing with that money? Maybe they're buying boats to have in a boat parade or something. But yeah, I find it worrisome, and I really think that it's the kind of thing that, like, once this genie is out of the bottle, so to speak, of this kind of political symbolism, it's very hard to get it back in, and that's in essence, I think, one of my fears about the election is not so much who wins or loses, but what kind of forces of political affiliation and mobilization does it unleash. And of course, that is why people use the F word, use fascism. Like, is it going to unleash all kinds of forms of street violence against people on the left, against immigrants, against African Americans, and so forth. I mean, I think that like if it comes wrapped in a thin blue line flag, I don't think we can be terribly surprised.
Thanks for that answer. I appreciate it. This next question is from Gerald Davidson from Wisconsin, who asked that I read it for him. He asks, did the police assistance program after World War II intersect with the CIA and NATO planting of stay-behind armies?
You know, I think that intersect is a word that could mean a couple different things. Intersect, yes. Are they the same? No. The idea of the stay behind army is about basically, you know, what do you do if there is a communist revolution? Who will engage in the kind of political warfare to then unseat this new communist regime? The police assistance program was designed to prevent that communist takeover from happening in the first place, right? And in fact, there were really strong debates that I go into some detail explaining in my book. There were really strong debates within the national security apparatus, the intelligence apparatus, about whether it was a good idea to try to, you know, teach U.S. allied forces to, you know, fight communist guerrillas with their own form of guerrilla warfare, or if the idea should be to, and that would ultimately be, you know, the work of special forces, you know, Green Berets and so forth, and the stay behind armies are connected to that. Or should the potential communist guerrillas be neutralized in the first place through detection, surveillance, intelligence, and so forth, and then ultimately be jailed or you know, neutralized through violence, and that would be the responsibility of police, right? So this is a debate that happens within the national security apparatus. Ultimately, I would argue that the police side wins. Byron Engel's Office of Public Safety wins simply because the idea of that, you know, fighting communist guerrillas with guerrillas of our own just never worked. And those stay behind armies, you know, of course, were ultimately linked to various forms of terrorism, right-wing terrorism. But that's really a kind of separate story from my story.
Thanks. Up next, I have Nancy Goldner. Nancy, would you like to ask your question of Stuart? Go ahead.
Okay, I wondered if you would comment on the School of the Americas in terms of your research.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So the School of the Americas was the Army's, it still exists. It's no longer called the School of the Americas. It was the Army's training facility for Latin American militaries. And of course, one of the things that it was most deeply trying to train Latin American militaries to do was to prevent, you know, communist infiltration, communist revolution, and so forth. So it worked in tandem with the Office of Public Safety. It preceded the Office of Public Safety, and then it continued to exist after the Office of Public Safety was shut down. But initially, the Office of Public Safety actually operated a facility right next door to the School of the Americas in the Panama Canal Zone. And they shared some training facilities, they shared some attendees, they shared some instructors. So they worked really closely. The Office of Public Safety, you know, figures like Engel, who ran it, they were a little worried that if their operation was seen to be too similar to the School of the Americas, that it would get shut down, because some penny pinching congressman would say, hey, we already do this army training, why are we doing the same thing for police? That's redundant. Let's close shop. So ultimately, that was part of the reason, one of a few reasons, but a major reason why the Office of Public Safety opened its police training academy in the Georgetown neighborhood in Washington, D.C., because then there would be no question about whether it was you know, too close to the School of the Americas. It would now be, you know, thousands of miles away, and the argument could very strongly be made that this is a totally different type of facility. It's concerned with police. It's not concerned with only military. And also, it is now going to accept officers from other places beyond Latin America, which it did. So it accepted officers from Asia and Africa as well.
Thanks. Next up, we have Michael Hoey. Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I've been reading too many books, and trying to wrap my head around all this is really a challenge. So I read your review this morning of the Jakarta method by Vincent Bivens. And so that kind of adds in a new methodology and a new training center, Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, in addition to all these other training centers, say for Latin America with School of America, the School of Americas, and maybe the Drug Enforcement Administration. I don't know where they were playing or training. And so I'm just trying to wrap my head around the bigger picture. I mean, you have stuff going back to the days of the Philippines. Alfred McCoy writes about this, was happening over 120 years ago. But since World War II, it's just scaled up as our empire has grown. And we have these training facilities all over. I mean, the cost to terrorize or control and contain people and wipe out communism has been mind-boggling. And can you help me wrap my head around all these different training centers, all these different programs, all the lack of coordination between the FBI and the CIA and the drug enforcement and the multiple intelligence agencies?
Well, I'm not sure that I can resolve this. You know, thank you for reading my review of the Jakarta method. You know, it's absolutely true that there are a lot of different agencies put to work in fighting the Cold War, and the Cold War ends, and you know, there's maybe a very, very, very brief window when it seems like some of this might be reined in, but ultimately it isn't. And even beyond all of the government agencies, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, State Department, DOD, you know, beyond all of these agencies, there's also private firms involved now, which is something that I'm trying to do some new research and writing on. Researching private firms is really, really hard because the info just is not there. They don't make their info available. You know, investigative journalists have done some good work on this stuff, but it's really hard to know. So the picture is extremely complicated. There's a lot of redundancy. There's no real coordination. And one of the things that's so interesting is that the Office of Public Safety in the 60s into the 70s, you know, was one centralized node for coordinating police assistance across the globe. It was shut down by Congress in part because of the peace movement, in part because of accusations that Office of Public Safety was involved in teaching torture and various other atrocities. So movement activists with the North American Congress on Latin America, the Institute for Policy Studies, and various other organizations ultimately were successful in getting the Office of Public Safety shut down. They worked with a senator named James Aberesk from South Dakota, who is a one-term, fairly progressive senator. Shut down the Office of Public Safety. The legislation that shut it down is still on the books. The United States is still, under the Foreign Assistance Act, not authorized to provide police training and assistance. And yet, somehow, you know, thousands of police around the globe are being trained and assisted by the United States. Well, how is that possible? Basically, because there are some kind of carve-outs and, you know, backdoor methods that skirt that legislation. But what it means is that there's no Office of Public Safety today. Now, I don't think there should be an Office of Public Safety today, but it's certainly true that there is no single coordinating body. If there were one coordinating body, then we could potentially FOIA their records and, you know, perhaps, you know, get some friendly Congress people to haul their leaders before Congress to make them testify, which is what happened with the Office of Public Safety. But that body doesn't exist right now. So it's really, really hard for you know, activists, voters, whoever, to find out the full scale and scope of this. But you know, all I can say is, like, you read a lot of books, you're going to have to keep reading more, and you're just going to find that the picture only gets more tangled and confusing as you go. I mean, it's like I focus on this one relatively discrete agency in my book. There are other agencies that I didn't focus on, and then if I extended the story past the mid 1970s, it would be a whole different roster of agencies, like, as you mentioned, the DEA and others. So yeah, it's huge, it's massive, it's complicated, it's confusing. That makes it that much harder to shut it down.
Thanks. Next up, we have John Sonin. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong, John. John, you have to unmute yourself so we can all hear your question.
No, you said it just perfect, Brian. A lot of people like to say Simon, but it's Sonin. And yes, Stuart wanted to ask you about probably as a result of misinformation, but wouldn't I guess let's make it short. Wouldn't the lack of public oversight stop this privatizing of and militarization of our public safety organizations?
So is it because of a lack of oversight? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and the other issue I was trying to bring in was the education necessary to oversee I'm thinking of Plato and Guardians and to oversee the safety of the public.
Yeah. No, I would say that absolutely. One of the things that having such a powerful police apparatus in the United States does, and because so much resources go to the police, and because there's such a strong ideological argument made in our society that police keep us safe, what this means is that ultimately interpersonal dispute resolution, community-based modes of mediation, of solving problems, of helping each other, all of these basically have been weakened, neutralized, dismantled, right? So I do think that there is a kind of educational component, as you suggest, which is to, we need to teach ourselves through political education, through concerted efforts. We need to teach ourselves to solve our own problems, mediate our own disputes, and not dial 911 thinking that that is going to solve our problems, because in fact usually it makes our problems worse, right? So absolutely, I do think that there is a huge responsibility for people to learn alternative methods of finding safety and security that don't involve the police, because in fact the police rarely do provide what people want in terms of security. I always ask my students to imagine what it feels like to be safe and secure. They always say like, oh, I imagine being at my grandma's house, or I imagine going for a walk in the woods, or whatever. It's like they never say, when I imagine what it feels like to be safe and secure, I have a top and body armor with a rifle pointed at me. And so it's just like, why should we give those responsibilities over to police? I mean, we have effectively done that, but I think we need a kind of revolution in the way we think about this stuff in order to change the situation. Yeah, I'll stop there. Maybe we can take another question.
All right, next we have Barbara Briggs-Letson with a question. Go ahead, Barbara.
Hi. I'm interested in your take on how the Israeli sales of technology and weapons and training is affecting our militarization of our police?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I should say first of all that I'm not an expert on the question of Israel, because in large part, most of my research focuses on the period up to the 1970s and the relationships that currently exist in terms of counterterrorism training and so forth with Israel. Those come after the middle of the 1970s. So I haven't, really researched them. And in fact, they're really quite hard to research. I do think it's true that Israel is a kind of outsized presence in terms of developing surveillance technologies and other, border control technologies, other types of weaponry. Whether they, dominate the marketplace, I think is unclear to me. I think that it's absolutely true that these Israeli firms do a really good job of marketing their products, but there are a lot of American firms as well as other firms as well in the marketplace. So is Israel particularly nefarious in terms of the technologies it develops? I mean, I think that is a question that I can't really answer because I just don't know enough about it. I do think that there's a certain value perversely in presenting your products as the most nefarious products. Like that makes them more marketable. But are they actually the most nefarious? I don't know. So I think that the marketing might be very successful. But, ultimately, I would just say, as far as like the training goes, this is another place where I think there's real possibilities for local, concerted local political mobilization to have a palpable effect. In Durham, North Carolina, the city council, based on some campaigns by local activists, the city council banned police training with other countries. They were thinking mainly of Israel, but I think the legislation actually said, any police training with other countries. This is, city councils could do this all across the country. And I think they should. And I think, it's basically up to, the left to come up with basically cookie cutter legislation that they can just provide to city councils to do this. It's like the right, the business class, they have their cookie cutter legislation. I think the left needs to do the same thing. The one thing I would say is that like, it might actually be a good idea for the United States to learn from law enforcement in some other countries where they are less brutal. Which countries those are, I'm not sure, but there are some.
How about Norway?
Yeah, that's the one people always point to. And perhaps.
All right, we have time for one last question, and the honor belongs to Michael Eisenschur. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, too.
Perfect. Thank you. Actually, I have two. One's very short. Are you aware of any studies of the impact on public budgeting or participatory budgeting on police conduct? Where
I'm not.
Communities can weigh in on how money is spent.
Yeah, I mean, I know about participatory budgeting. I think that, from what I've understood about it, it is not usually applied to, sectors of the budget like the police budget. I think it absolutely should be, but I'm not aware of any experiences where that has actually happened.
Okay. My other question is whether you are able to comment on the role that the NSA, CIA, and FBI have on policing use of electronic surveillance.
Well, so what we do know is that over the summer, especially when federal law enforcement was involved, so in places like Portland and DC, as well as other places where federal law enforcement was operating, but we don't really know. absolutely they were using technologies that would be used by what we would consider the national security state, the CIA or FBI or whatever. It's absolutely the case that those technologies were used. What they were capable of, I think, is a little bit hard to know. It seems like the FBI was flying, or maybe it was DHS, was flying an airplane that was probably sucking up the phone signals of basically everybody all at once. Certainly there's surveillance, high resolution video, and so forth.
Have the federal agencies actually provided those technologies to police departments?
Right now, in Baltimore, probably within like 5 miles of where I'm sitting, there are federal law enforcement agencies operating alongside BPD. They're engaged in various types of investigations and enforcement that gives BPD access to technologies they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford or have access to. So that kind of like joint operations is the most common way that police get access to these technologies. The airplane that can fly over and suck up everybody's phone signals, like the FBI are not sharing that. It's like that's their toy, and they may deploy it in various situations, but they're not going to loan it to a municipal police force.
I know there are departments that are using license plate readers.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the one other thing I would just say about this is that there are private firms that are operating. So again, speaking of Baltimore, there's a surveillance plane that flies over Baltimore every day for hours and hours and hours, basically making a recording of everything in the city. This technology was developed for use in Iraq. The company is called Persistent Surveillance Systems. When it first started operating in Baltimore, the mayor didn't even know about it. Certainly no residents of Baltimore knew about it. They just saw an airplane flying overhead. Now the mayor, the police chief, and some people on city council have basically said it's okay. A judge said it's okay. But Baltimore City is not funding it. It's being funded by billionaire philanthropists, right? And the idea is that this technology being tested in Baltimore after it was first tested in Iraq, eventually will be, it could be perfected and then ultimately adopted in many other cities around the country and even around the globe. So, Baltimore is the kind of laboratory right now. And supposedly it's going to be going to St. Louis next. So it's going to go to another majority Black city, most likely be funded by an out-of-town billionaire. I think this type of technological advance, even perhaps more so than what the CIA or NSA might be able to provide. I think this is where the action really is, in addition to what I mentioned, the kind of joint operations with DEA or DHS or whatever that local police are engaged in.
Well, thank you, Stuart. It's getting late and we probably should end after that question. I really appreciate your joining us and giving us the benefit of your insight. It's extremely sobering what we're up against and how many years this has been developed. And I do take your fundamental point that as a peace organization, we have to make common cause with the anti-police, anti-incarceration activists domestically and show those linkages and show the connections. So that's one of the biggest takeaways I'm taking with me tonight. Stuart, if you want to say a final word on anything, feel free.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Sorry that I'm kind of verbose, but I'm easy to find. I'm on Twitter. You can also find me easily by Googling. Feel free to be in touch. I can't promise that I can answer your questions, but like I said, I'm easy to find. And my book, Badges Without Borders, is also easy to find on bookshop.org, on the University of California Press website. And I think Cole will circulate a discount code for everybody to get it cheaper from the University of California Press. So thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Stuart. It was great to talk to you tonight.
Great.
And thank you, everyone, for joining. We appreciate it. And we will send out a video of the recording as well as some of the resources that have been provided by Stuart and others as we went through the evening. Thank you all.